Get started. Again, welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESGCV. My name is Shavonna McCaleb, and I am today's moderator. If you are just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and region you represent. As a reminder, this office hours session is being recorded for public record. Office hours recordings are on the HCD ESG webpage under Technical Assistance and Training. A copy of the slide deck and recording will also be emailed to you by your grant administrator or annual representative. Next slide, please. How to ask a question. All questions must be submitted in the chat box. Please type your organization and question into the chat box. The team will read questions aloud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers, if possible, throughout the presentation. All questions and answers entered into the chat box will be recorded as part of the public record. Alongside our presenters, we also have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESGCV grant administrators, and consultants who are able to answer questions during the Q&A session. Next slide, please. Today's office hours session agenda includes the following: announcements, ESG, ESGCV updates, office hours update, ESG and ESGCV Q&A, and today's brown bag session on equal access rule. Next slide, please. HCD ESG office hours calendar invite. Please note that the current office hours Zoom invite was set to expire in May. The calendar invite has now been extended to go through 9/30. All current office hours registrants should have received an email from Zoom yesterday with an updated calendar schedule. You will have to download the new calendar invite for the email sent by Zoom in order to get the office hours meeting on your calendar until 9:30. You can always re-register, as well as in case the option above does not work for you. The office hours registration link is on this slide. It will also be emailed out to you. Next slide. And now I will hand it over to Connie for ESG updates.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you. So the 2022 ESG NOFA applications, we intend to release those the end of May. And of course, for those who have been applying for many years, within 2 weeks after the release of the NOFA and the application, we'll be doing the webinars for the application training webinars. 2021 ESG applications, all the award letters were emailed to those awardees last Friday on April 1st. We anticipate standard agreements being executed for these 2021 contracts by the end of July. For those that have 2020 ESG annual contracts, just a reminder again that the expenditure date is July 7th. That is not very far away, only about 3 months away. Keep in mind that you can apply and utilize those COVID waivers with your towards your annual ESG 2020 annual ESG contract. If you're not sure what that means or what you can use, please reach out to your ESG representative, and we'd be happy to get on a Teams call with you and help you through that. Looks like I need to have a next slide, please. Okay, just again, a few weeks ago, we are trying to gather, we being the ESG annual team, trying to gather information and dollar amounts for all those that had 2018, 19, and currently have 2020 ESG annual contracts. We want to know waivers that you may have used, the COVID waivers, applied toward your annual ESG contracts. We need that information so we can submit that to HUD. A spreadsheet for you to enter in that information and a waiver template that there was a checkbox for you to tell us what waivers you had or are using was sent to you by your rep several weeks ago. If you did not receive this, if you haven't had a chance to get to it or you weren't sure what to do, please reach out to us. Reach out to your ESG rep. You can reach out to me, the ESG NOFA box, but we do need to get that information in as soon as possible. Next slide, please. And again, here's your ESG annual team members. You can always reach your rep, and you can always reach us at esgnofa@hcd.ca.gov. Thank you. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Connie. Now I have just a few ESG CV updates and reminders. Every ESG CV grantee subrecipient needs to submit an RFF by 4/20 for review to their grant administrator and must provide an updated accrual amount. Again, I will say we are asking that every grantee subrecipient submit an RFF by 4/20. Quarter 6 report online form is being prepared and will be emailed
on your
out.
calendar. It's in your calendar. Open it up.
If we could please have everyone mute. Thank you. Quarter 6 report online form is being prepared and will be emailed out soon by your grant administrator. Next slide, please. Upcoming office hours topics. On 4/13, HCD homeless prevention policy. On 4/20, language access plan, duplication of benefits. On 4/27, engagement with tribal nations. Next slide, please. COVID response resources. I will not read the links that we have on here. This slide will be emailed out with the slides. Slide 11. ESG resource links. Links will also be in the slides when emailed out. Next slide, please. At this time, if there are any questions, please put them in the chat and you may continue throughout the presentation. Okay, if there are no questions at this time, slide 13, if we can go back one slide, please. Contact us. If you have any further questions, please contact us at Annual ESG. Please reach out to your ESG representative or esg@hcd.ca.gov. And for ESG, please reach out to your grant administrator. Next slide, please. And now I will hand it over to Chris Pitcher for today's brown bag presentation on Equal Access Rule, EAR tool, planning for LGBTQ plus inclusion. Thank you.
Thanks, Shavana, and thank you all for joining us this morning over there in California. It is my pleasure today to have with us Abby Miller, who has been with us before, but this is a topic that Abby knows very well from her time at HUD. So we really wanted to give a chance to do a quick overview of the Equal Access Rule. I will make sure to say this, I'll have Abby say it as well. This is the beginning of this conversation and not at all even close to the end. We do have other community workshops, other smaller group workshops being planned for Equal Access Rule. So if this is something that is interesting to you, you're going to have plenty of more opportunities to have these conversations. So without any further delay, I will hand it over to our presenter today, Abby Miller. Abby, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris. Hello, good morning. I am in New York City. You will quite likely hear sirens and, I don't know, dump trucks coming through my living room. So I appreciate your grace in advance. My name is Abby, and I use she, they pronouns. I just want to start with that because for those of you who have never known anybody who's used they, them as their pronouns, I can be your test bunny. If there's anything that you want to ask about those pronouns, feel free to ask me. I have therapy, I have good social networks, And I always appreciate when people ask me questions versus asking clients questions. So I will just preface with that. If you can go to the next slide. Beautiful. Oh goodness, these are not supposed to come up like this. Can you just keep clicking? There we go, perfect. Hold it there. I wanted to start by going through this very long acronym that is an umbrella term. And I'm just gonna run pretty quickly through these. If you do attend the later trainings and subsequent community workshops that I will be in with a few of my colleagues as well, I will talk about these more in depth, or somebody will talk about these more in depth. But quickly, I think for those of you on the call who are not part of the queer community, including, probably there are a number of you that identify as A for ally. But if this is new to you in any way, I think it's helpful to just start by running through what is this all about. So this umbrella term of LGBTQIA2S+ is such a mouthful, but it's a mouthful for a reason. It is including a lot of people under that umbrella. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer or questioning, intersex, ally, two-spirit, plus. That is a lot of terms. There is a separation that I want to make in here. This umbrella includes folks with sexual orientations that are not straight. And it also includes gender identities that are not cisgender, meaning your gender aligns with the sex that you were assigned at birth. So what is gender identity? It is the intrinsic, internal knowledge of who you are in terms of gender. That gender could be on the poles of man, woman, and anywhere in between, and it can move. So the reason why I use she, they pronouns is because I identify as gender fluid. I don't really feel like one of the poles or the others, and it kind of changes over time, sometimes from week to week, but it's fluid, hence gender fluid. Gender expression, as opposed to gender identity, which is very much each person's internal knowledge of who they are. Gender expression is how you show the world your gender. It doesn't have to match your gender identity, but it gets sticky, particularly in this topic that we're talking about here in congregate facilities that are almost always gender segregated. Gender expression can be read by somebody else, and then they perceive, well, you're this gender or you're that gender. I'm sure you can imagine the number of mistakes and quandaries that happen because of those assumptions based on what somebody looks like. But expression generally is what you are trying to show the world, whether the world sees it or not. Sexual orientation has really nothing to do with your gender. It has to do with your attraction to other genders. So pansexual, I am attracted to anybody regardless of gender. Bisexual talks more about the poles, right? Man, woman. Although I think increasingly it includes everyone under that. Lesbian, gay, I think those terms we're all very familiar with. But sexual orientation and gender identity are not at all the same thing. They are contained under the same umbrella because our community, the LGBTQIA2S+ community, recognize that everybody who is part of these marginalized sexual orientations or gender identities, that we've all been marginalized. We've all been excluded, discriminated against in different degrees and severity. But that we're all one. We are all together under this umbrella and looking out for each other. Transgender, the T, means you're born, in almost all cases, a doctor or a midwife is going to be assigning a sex to you at that time. Then you get older, and you don't even have to be that much older, but you then understand what gender you are. And if it doesn't match, that is the trans part. Cisgender, match. Transgender, opposite. Now, transgender, I'm actually going to bump down to non-binary and pull in gender fluid here as well, because they're all kind of, as our understanding of gender identity evolves, we are having more and more terms that people are using. I have younger friends who regularly are coming up with labels that I've never heard before, and I have to be Googling. I feel like the grandpa of the group at times. But it is evolving, and it's evolving because we're talking about it, because we're getting comfortable with it, and because younger people are getting more and more okay at younger ages saying, this is how I feel, this is how I identify, which I think is quite beautiful, and we all have a lot to learn from them. But so transgender was the single term that used to be used. We now have a lot of terms to describe, I would just say, the gray space between the poles of man and woman. So non-binary is one, just I don't identify with one or the other. Gender fluid, like I said, it can move. Gender queer, so many terms. I think the important thing with all of these is not that you memorize them and feel like you can use them all absolutely correctly. That's great if you can, and you do. But the more important thing to know is that there's a whole world of people who are identifying in different ways, and you will be served if you are curious about somebody's, if you're curious about how somebody identifies, and then don't go any further to ask intrusive questions. I will get to that. And the final thing on here, transitioning, and this is going to be super important for this whole topic. There is this idea of transitioning that has been misread by a lot of folks to some very bad ends. Transitioning means the moment that you feel that your gender identity or your sexual orientation is not what you were told that it was, you are then going through a process internally, socially, of transitioning. You come out to people, sometimes all at once, sometimes just little by little. The important thing is that transitioning and we use this for gender identity, transitioning has nothing to do with surgery or medical appointments or hormone therapy. Yes, those may be part of it, but they are by no means part of a necessary formula. So if you say, oh, but you haven't transitioned, because that doesn't fly. Transitioning is very much a social and personal and interpersonal experience. Okay.
Abby, I'm gonna,
Yes.
before you go to the next slide, we do
Mhm.
have a question in the chat about pronouns that I think is appropriate for this particular slide. So I want to just ask it
Great.
now. So with your pronouns, how do we know when to use she and they? And for you, is that interchangeable, or are there certain
Interchangeable.
circumstances where it's not?
Yeah, interchangeable. Thank you. And what a great question. That is, if somebody walks through the door of your program and has asked that question, I can't think of a scenario where they wouldn't be very happy to be asked that question. There's no, well, why, or just how do you want me to use them? So for me, it's either one. Sometimes I get she, sometimes I get they. They both feel fine to me. And if one didn't ever feel fine, I would just drop it.
Yeah. So we also have another question. Is it okay just to write LGBTQ plus and not have to go through all those other letters? I think that's folks just want to be appropriate.
Yeah, different schools of thought here. I think that writing LGBTQ plus is great. I think writing the whole thing still is not capturing everybody. There isn't every letter up here. Gender fluid's not here. Non-binary is not here. So, you know, if you put the plus, that indicates like, I understand that this umbrella is bigger. Yep. Anything else?
No, that's all we've seen so far. So I think we can go to the next one. Thanks, Abby.
Yeah. Okay. So I am not going to read all of these out loud. I would like to let these wash over you. The point here is that this rule, the equal access rule, was created because we have a huge problem. We have a problem in all fields, but because homelessness is, to my mind, it is the result of every other safety net having been pulled out from under somebody, or they just fell through because it's a bad safety net. And in this country, people who are queer, transgender, sexual orientation that's not straight, it is even greater. So on the left, you have just, you have statistics about LGBTQ plus youth. And see here, it says LGBT youth. So all these terms are used interchangeably. And on the right, you can see how those risks just ratchet up for transgender youth. Remembering that transgender, when they say that, is also, you know, in that expansive way, non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer. So we have a major problem in our field, and these are about young people because we have better data on young people. We're able to track it more. But there are also adults and older folks in our systems who have been living this life experience and struggling throughout. So I think a lot of the work that's been done in our field is coming from young people focused on ending youth homelessness. But I think we can't forget that there are also older people that haven't had any attention until maybe the last, 5 to 10 years. Okay, can go on. Thank you. So HUD's equal access rule. First, there are two. There was one that was published in 2012. The 2016 one, all it did was update the 2012 one. So there's sometimes people refer to it as the gender identity rule. I think for the most part, equal access, people generally know what we're talking about, but I just want to be clear about that. So what the 2012 one did is the second line here, equal access is provided in all HUD assisted programs, regardless of sexual orientation, marital status, or gender identity. Now, I have been talking solely about LGBTQ plus so far, but it also includes marital status. And that's important. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But the idea here in 2012 was, okay, we know we have a problem of people being denied. And at that time, the Fair Housing Act was not being interpreted as covering sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, since 2012, we've had a major change. The Supreme Court has put out a ruling, the current Supreme Court has put out a ruling that gender identity and sexual orientation are inherently part of gender, therefore fall under sex-based discrimination. But at the time, that didn't exist. So, or at least it was not being interpreted in that way. So in 2012, that was the rule. I started working on this in 2014, and I was at HUD then. Sorry, I didn't say that. I was at HUD for the better part of the last decade. No longer am. And what we were working on from 2014 to 2016 was one little clause that was left in that rule that said, we're going to not weigh in on sex segregated facilities just yet. And so that was the work that we did over those few years of, okay, how are we going to approach this? And where we arrived is what you see here. Self-reported gender identity is the factor in placing and serving individuals. So that means if somebody's ID does not match the gender that they're telling you, if the birth certificate is not, whatever sort of proof of identity that people have, if the what is often sex markers on there don't match the gender that that they identify as, you follow the self-report, not the documents. That also means not requiring proof. In the time that I've been working on this, I have seen all sorts of things that have been asked of clients, including, really pointed questions about, well, have you had the surgery? We're talking about genitalia, and that is not something to ask people about. It's not something that others will see. It is not something that is really anybody's business. So that self-reported gender identity is not something that has to be backed up by medical proof or government proof like the ID, or to have somebody discuss such an intensely private and what can be very traumatic thing. And then the last two pieces here, you have to update. If you are an agency that receives any HUD funding, your policies and procedures have to be updated to reflect these requirements. So if you were monitored, somebody would come in and they would see that you had clearly adopted these because they're in your policies and procedures. And the last thing is taking non-discriminatory steps to address privacy concerns. There are a number of programs that over the years have attempted to create safer spaces within their facilities. So sometimes they'll have like unfortunately, it'll be called like, well, we have our transgender room, which not only outs somebody immediately, but it also removes their ability to request accommodations in the manner that they see fit. So what I mean by that, if you have a congregate facility and somebody comes in and they just want to be treated like everybody else in that center, which is often the case. But you already have a policy in place that says, oh, nope, you go to that room. It has the effect of isolating and segregating people. And per this rule, that is not allowed. Okay, next slide. The last piece, and this is not only the equal access rule, but it's also, it's the equal access rule as well as the COC program interim rule. They're kind of blended together here. So in the COC interim rule, it says you may not reject any part of a family. So it's the involuntary family separation rule, or part of the rule. And then in the equal access rule, you are not allowed to discriminate or refuse access based on marital status. And you're also not allowed to based on gender identity. So if you have a family shelter and you say, well, we only serve women here, that is a misnomer because families are made up of people beyond women. And so if you have any families that have minor children, then you have to serve all families with minor children. And all of the compositions are listed there. This one often gets people. So if you have questions about it, please ask. But the idea here is that we don't get to determine which type of family gets served. We would never say based on race that a family can't come in? Why would we say based on gender that a family can't come in? Okay, I think, did you drop that link in the chat, Chris? Great. That FAQ really lays out, you know, the interplay between the equal access rule and the COC program rule. Okay, next slide. Right, so planning for inclusion. Wow, as I look at this rainbow, I have to say I'm very happy with this. I love using the rainbow as much as possible. So there's the equal access rule. There's the stuff you have to do, and then there's what you should do. So this is really about planning for inclusion beyond just the strict boundaries of the equal access rule. Because you can follow the equal access rule, but still not have a very welcoming program. And the idea here is we want to be welcoming to all so that nobody is making a decision to sleep on the street rather than come into your facility. So the first is modeling appropriate and affirming behavior. I think, was it Veronica that asked, when do you use she and they? Beautiful. You've recognized the use of pronouns, you've recognized that pronouns are a thing, and you're asking how I prefer to use them. And there's modeling affirming behavior, there is self-work that has to get done behind the scenes, sometimes to be able to show up that way. I think the important thing here is that I can't change hearts and minds. You may disagree with this wholeheartedly. That's fine. But when you show up to a professional setting where you're serving others, you have to put that somewhere and model appropriate behavior. Not only for the other staff, for the other clients. The second, you only ask for information that you need. So this is ask me, don't ask your clients. If you are curious and you don't feel like searching the internet, or it just feels overwhelming, or you just really like to get information from somebody else, please find that elsewhere, outside of the facility, outside of your place of work. I probably would not say, ask me anything about my pronouns if I worked directly with you every day. And certainly not if I was seeking services from you. The third is to maintain confidentiality and privacy. So sometimes staff will feel like, oh, okay, somebody came in, they identify as non-binary, I should probably tell all of the staff that. Not necessarily. That person will tell you what they want to disclose and what they don't want to disclose. So asking that, what do you want staff to know here? What do you want clients to know here? Is how you then set the right guardrails for confidentiality and privacy, because it's based on the client and what they want and need. The fourth, ask name. So when you're entering an HMIS, you have to ask for legal name. That can be a traumatizing moment. Sometimes you may just want somebody to write it down and you can see the discomfort come up. So there's what do we call you? And then what's your legal name? If you want to just write it on this piece of paper, we never have to hear the word out loud. But you ask what somebody is called because it is maybe different than the legal name. You ask pronouns and you ask title. Title is like Miss, Mr., Mrs. Mix is very fun. MX is used for those of us who hang out in the gray space of gender. But again, don't assume, if it's, I lived and worked in the South for a while and it's Miss followed by the name, that gets hairy if you're, if you haven't asked what that title is. The fifth, take immediate action. When you see harassment, bullying, violence, discrimination, anything that is happening to a client, and this is across the board, stepping in that very moment, even if you feel paralysis inside, there has to be immediate action. Now that indicates that something has to happen before that event is occurring, which is training. So we will talk about that more in the longer training, but this is so important. It sends a signal to that person that they are important. It sends a signal to all the other clients that if this is occurring to them, that there will be action. And it signals to the harassers or the bullies, this is unacceptable. Making dress codes gender neutral. So this, maybe this applies to you, maybe it doesn't. But I have read, like resident policies and procedures. They say like skirts must be blah, 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 or like women must not show their midriff, whatever it is, just take the gender right on out of it. So if you have like, whatever you're wearing on the bottom has to come past the knees. There you go. It doesn't matter. It's a skirt or a, whatever it is. And the last is, again, going to take some work on staff's part before the moment happens. But if you have residents come in who do have a gender identity that is not strictly cisgender, knowing who in your community provides gender affirming healthcare is a life-saving function, life-saving. So doing that work ahead of time and having your cheat sheet, like I know that I can always send people to this place, that quite honestly saves lives. Okay, I've seen some questions come in, but I haven't read them because I'm just talking.
I'm going to hold them to the end, Abby. I think we
Okay.
can keep them moving.
Great. So this slide is purely to show you what is available to you already related to the equal access rule. There is a guidebook that I worked on with my colleagues, Fran Ledger and David Canavan, if you've ever had the pleasure to work with them. And we created this guidebook and training scenarios. The training scenarios really are like, what would you do in this situation? You know, it lays out a little scenario and lets staff walk through it. And then the one that I want to talk about a little bit today, or just show you a little bit today, is the agency assessment tool. If you're able to pull it up, Taylor. Thank you. So no need to try to read this. I only wanted to pull this up to walk you through it and so that you could hear like what the concept is behind it. So we put this together thinking it's kind of daunting. If you haven't done any of this work before, of course, this was 2015 when we did this, but it can be a very daunting task if you're just starting. So the idea here is that you take your own assessment. So Taylor, if you go over to the assessment tab. Beautiful. There are all of these items that are goals that a very inclusive, welcoming, and compliant program would want to have. And then for each goal, you can say, yes, we have a written policy. Yes, everybody is trained to comply. And yes, all clients are aware of this. And so you go through and you check honestly, because this is a self-assessment. Nobody's taking this and using it, but it's for your use. So once you fill it out, Taylor, if you go over to the outputs, totally blank right now, but if you jump to the library of steps, we basically weighted the different goals behind the scenes to say, which of these are super important, like the most important, you must focus on these immediately if you're a no on them, to things that are, if you've done all of this, then here's the next place to go, because the work really is not done on this kind of thing. So what this library of steps becomes is you do your assessment, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And the coding that's in this tool is going to pop up the things that are the most important for you to work on. The idea being you work on, and it only gives you like, I think maybe 3 to 5 steps to work on so that it's not overwhelming. But 6 months, year later, you've done a lot of work, go back and do it again. Go through yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, and see what comes up. So the idea is that this assessment tool can help you grow and grow with you. All right, thanks, Taylor. Next slide. Or is that the last one?
It was the last one. Thank you, Abby. So we have reached our discussion point for today. Feel free to come off mute, ask questions, raise your hand, or ask a question in the chat. I do have 2 questions to start us with, Abby, so I'll start there while folks kind of let this all sink in. That was fantastic information. I really appreciate it. So this is a specific question about recommendation on training materials for congregate shelter staff. Thinking of doing staff training when they're confronted with folks who disagree with inclusion. Many folk, that a lot of those concerns, are unfounded or not, rooted in something else. But do we have any good guides or good training materials other than what we just showed on the last slide that you would recommend for folks kind of in a congregate shelter setting?
Yes. So first of all, in those training scenarios, that's absolutely part of some of the scenarios. I think also, oh my goodness, why is my mind blanking out? Cyndi Lauper, True Colors, True Colors United. They have really great training materials, and I can send those to Chris so that he can send them around after this. And I will add a few more on there that if I couldn't even remember True Colors United, I'm not going to pull up the other names out of my brain, but I will put them down on paper and get them to Chris.
And Abby, a lot of the work happening in this space from HUD and from the work that we do as Technical Inspired has primarily happened through the youth homelessness demo programs and that type of work, which I know True Colors has been involved with. So that's another good place to look for some information, right?
Yes. Oh yeah, that's a great place. I think the YHDP page, there were some lessons learned published not long ago that I know that this was, I mean, not that specific scenario was in there, but those are great materials. I think in general, young people are showing us the way forward. So yeah, I think looking at the youth homelessness work is great.
So you had mentioned that in your pronouns, she and they, you would let folks know that that's what you were called. You would also put that in the signature line of your email or what have you. And I think you also mentioned that, as a coworker, you wouldn't necessarily be explaining why or addressing that. Do you want to expound upon that a little bit?
Yeah. So I think this is hopefully more familiar since a lot of the work that people have been trying to do specifically since George Floyd's murder related to race and racism, that the privilege of showing up to a workplace with white skin means that you are not going to be subjected to a number of questions about who you are or how you operate or why you do what you do. The same holds true for queer folks in the workplace. If you think about what you get to show up, and I'm using the you, I'm speaking to straight cisgender people right now. So if you get to show up to work with a very normative identity in all the senses, there is there's sort of, people will write your story in their head and keep moving. Okay, it's Chris, da da da. When they're confronted with difference, people get very curious, and that's natural. The problem is that when you're on the receiving end of it, you don't know when you're asking those questions how much trauma somebody has undergone. You don't know what has come before. So I had just recently, a friend of mine who's a trans guy met his partner's sister. And the first question that this partner's sister asked him was, "Oh, but your old name was," fill in the blank. And it was, I mean, this was a very interpersonal meeting, not even in the workplace, but that name to my friend is dead and toxic. It is associated with a period of his life where he was living in the closet with a lot of trauma around that. So every time you ask somebody a question, there are all these things that could be popping up for them. And so that's why I say in a professional workplace, it's best for you to educate yourself, and then also not think that you know all of it, even if you've educated yourself. But at least at that point, you can have informed camaraderie.
And I think dead naming for me is something that's more of a newer concept that I've learned myself that can be very, very harmful. I think it also goes with what's happening in the chat that I know you're not being able to see and keep up with, which is what I'm here for. A lot of what's the conversation back and forth is, it's not about all pieces of LGBTQ plus that is really kind of being the issue in many of our communities because of what's happening to the T of LGBTQ and what's happening nationally as far as laws and horrible things that are being put out there. And that seeps into the world of our clients as well. So I think that's kind of what I'm reading. And I knew that this would come up as this is the hot topic of the entire thing is the T. So just wondering if you had any thoughts about that. I mean, I'm abhorred by a lot of the things that are happening. I think many folks are, but that doesn't, our clients aren't in a bubble. They see this too, and they feel this too, and they operationalize it or internalize it in not always positive ways in interactions with other people in our shelters and systems.
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest issues with what is happening right now is a continuing trend of people feeling empowered to say that other people's lives are less than theirs. that you know, this is too subversive for children to understand. I have a nibbling, if you have not heard that word, it's my new favorite. It is the gender neutral version for niece and nephew, like sibling, nibbling, but it's actually just adorable. I have a nibbling who, from age 3, was very insistent that they are not a girl. And when you see the certainty that small children speak with about gender, when it was never talked about in the home. Should it have been? I don't know, maybe. But this child knows who they are, and they have for nearly a decade now. So this idea that if we talk about it, then something will happen is just not true. It's just not true. Kids know who they are. Adults know who they are. Adults actually have a harder time knowing who they are because a lot of stuff has gotten papered over the years. There was one other point that I wanted to make. In the shelters, or in congregate facilities, you know, really where the issues come up is when somebody doesn't clearly fit all of the gender markers that you think they should fit. So that also extends to really butch, still women identifying women, but very butch. You know, the treatment isn't terribly different, or it can be very similar. So it's not only the T in the whole umbrella, it comes to that dissonance between gender identity, gender expression, and then perceived gender identity. Like, what does that staff person think of me? And how are they treating me? So it really comes up around appearance, affect, and difference.
Thanks, Abby. I appreciate
Mhm.
that. We have 9 minutes left. You're welcome to come off mute, ask questions, have a discussion, bring up a scenario that you might have been dealing with. Certainly, this is your time. So, anyone like to have a conversation here with us on this particular topic? E-glasses. Sherry, I see you. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Very well. Go ahead.
In regards to a parent that is fully aware of their child having some issues with gender, but they deny it, totally deny it. You know, how does someone work with their child and the parent, because the children, like you said, they know, and the parent is in denial, and discipline comes in because they're so in denial and disciplining the child. How does somebody work with that?
In a family shelter, I'm assuming.
Family shelter in a home, and there could be other, in shelters, yeah, there could be things that come up that they don't want them to see, they don't want them to be around because of the denial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one, I do not feel equipped to really give like ABC on that. And I think it's probably something you can't. I mean, sitting in this position, there are many ways that folks might tackle it, and I don't feel in a position to say which ones are right and wrong.
Okay.
What I will say is that for kids who clearly understand something about their gender that their parents are not recognizing, the power of just positive adults in their life. I'm not talking about like, that you have to even have gender oriented conversations with them, but simply accepting a child for who they are goes a really long way. And I think in a shelter, that is a role that staff can play, that volunteers can play. Which is also why it's so important to also get vendors and volunteers trained on this. Because, a lot of times the daycare or, watching the kids when parents are in class or something, it's really important.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. Luis, I see your hand raised. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question or your statement.
Hi, Chris. So thank you so much for the great talk. One of the questions I have is, we are a fully inclusive agency, and I mean that in the broadest sense. We train staff, regarding all differences, whether people have processing differences or on the spectrum, whether, if we want to be able to communicate better with the deaf community, and definitely with the LGBTQ plus community. But we are the big ally in a very, very conservative community. And so I guess my statement to this is, when someone asks those questions outside the agency, it's just, we accept all genders equally. Everyone suffers from domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. And anyone who is a survivor of one of these crimes is welcome at our facilities. And it usually kind of quiets that conversation down within the community at large. They usually just don't ask any more questions, which is a help. But one of the questions I had, and I guess one of the questions I had actually relates to not so much how we are interacting, but we accept everybody. If your legal name does not match the gender that you tell us that you are, you go in as whatever gender you report on HMIS. So my follow-up question to that is, when HUD is looking at us, Chris, for how inclusive we are, sometimes being more inclusive may make us look like we are not, because we don't question. We don't say, oh, well, if you are a person somewhere on the trans side of the spectrum, or perhaps the non-binary side of the spectrum, then you have to go in this box. You know, so
So when
if someone's a
you're-
trans, yeah, if someone is a trans male who was born female and they say I'm a man, then that's how they go in the system.
Mhm.
Because
Yeah.
we do, because we are dealing with highly traumatized people, and we're sensitive to, we are sensitive to all of, to all of those issues. But we try to be a good ally, and I think that's what I'd like to offer to the rest of our partners here. Just try to be a good ally. There are so many people in the homeless community. They're struggling with so many barriers, and this is a big one. And yeah, Chris, it burns me to see the stuff in the laws that are going around. And then to your comment too about children, every child that I knew growing up or watched growing up, I was not surprised when they came out either, at whatever spectrum on LGBTQ, you could see that this was just them. And, children are children and they deserve love and care.
Yeah.
And adults who are survivors of horrible things and trauma deserve our care and concern. That's human. So maybe, I think I just, I think that sometimes I think we do need to improve where people don't know, but I also think that acceptance goes a long way.
It does. And when you're having those conversations outside of your agency with folks at other agencies, that goes a long way.
Yeah.
I mean, that is really proactive allyship. And one thing additional that I will say, when we were working on this rule, the victim service providers and the national DV advocacy groups were 100% at the table saying the same thing that you said today. They were such an ally for those of us working in the mainstream homeless programs.
Yeah. Well, we were required to be gender inclusive far sooner than the HUD requirements. So I think that we worked through a lot of those concerns because we do family bedrooms. It was really easy to accommodate men and people, within the LGBTQ plus spectrum, because you can put a person like that in a single room, and every room we added combination locks, and the guest selects the combination for the lock. So everyone has a private place. And if someone needs a communication, if there are not infrequently males in the shelter, it is mostly, women with their children of both genders. But if someone's uncomfortable or needs a private bathroom, there are a couple bathrooms in each, there's a bathroom in each hallway that is a singlet, with a full bath. And and anyone can use them. But if someone has said, no, I want to be, that's the only bathroom I'm going to use, then we may put aside, hey, reserve.
Yeah.
Reserve for room number, whatever. It doesn't identify, it doesn't identify them, but they may be asking for a disability accommodation and needing that bathroom for their own use just as easily. So there's a lot of ways you can do it without outing anybody. And while still allowing everybody to have a space that's private and comfortable within, at least within our format of a congregate facility.
Yeah, and
Thank
I wanted
you so
to,
much.
yeah, sorry, Abby. I wanted to address two things that you said that I thought were interesting, and that is, when we have folks identify and they just say I'm male, and they might actually be more things. You might not getting credit for being inclusive.
Exactly.
First of all, HUD doesn't think that way. Secondly, the last set of data standards, we now have different gender categories, and you can select more than one. That was a change. There's also a brand new work group at HUD working on the 2024 data standards that is looking at gender identity. That's one work group, and other at race and ethnicity, because our race and ethnicity categories are also not very good.
No, they're not.
They're not inclusive. They're not well used, and certainly when we use the term Native American or Alaska Native, that covers hundreds and thousands of different types of people that may not identify as that. So we are trying to work through some of those things, but I just want to be very clear. HUD is not digging you because everyone is binary. Though you have the ability now to say, oh yes, I'm a male, but I'm also transgender and I'm this and this. You can be more than one thing, because we understand that gender identity is not a single thing anymore. It never was, but we tried to make it. So I just wanted to address that.
Yeah.
Sadly, we ran out of time. I do want to plug that Abby Miller and her work group will be holding community workshops beginning June. That's 6 is a June, June 23rd, 9:30 to 1. I put the registration in the link. There are going to be several sessions. So if this is something that's interesting or you want to dig deeper in, we have plenty of opportunity to do so.
Yeah,
I want to thank you all for staying with us this entire time. And thank you, Abby, for your presentation. We will see you right back here next week.
All right. Thanks for the opportunity.